Welcome to the third part of my video series on the book that I recently issued titled Satoshi Nakamoto and the Origins of Bitcoin. So this video series started by trying to extract clues towards Satoshi Nakamoto's identity by investigating the technological background of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin white paper and its codebase. In this video, we're going to draft a profile of Satoshi Nakamoto before looking into potential ecosystems and candidates that can be linked to the creation of Bitcoin, and then we end up with a view on the bigger picture. For now, let's start drafting Satoshi Nakamoto's profile. Let's look at other facts. So we have a pseudonym. That means that was a deliberate decision by the creator of Bitcoin, who evidently had a different name, right? How to configure this name, how to set up this name. So if you know a little bit about Japanese culture and Japanese people, you know that Satoshi is quite a common name, and Nakamoto would also not be a very striking exception for that. So if you meet somebody from Japan and they introduce themselves as Satoshi Nakamoto and Bitcoin hadn't been invented, that would be just another name like Joe Smith or something like that in an English-speaking environment. It wouldn't raise any eyebrows. There's actually, and was at the time also, quite a vivid cryptographer scene in Japan, and you find like more or less related researchers who had the first name Satoshi, and you have like different names that are quite similar sounding as Nakamoto. So maybe Satoshi Nakamoto wanted to pretend that he was coming out of the Japanese crypto ecosystem. I mean, the name didn't really strike. I mean, a lot of people reported who were initially in contact with Satoshi Nakamoto that they really thought, okay, that was a credible Japanese identity. They didn't even question whether there was a real Japanese person behind this name. So Satoshi Nakamoto, by choosing this name, he wanted to identify in the early Bitcoin community as a single male, because Satoshi is just a guy, and of Japanese nationality. There was no evident reference to historic or cultural figure, right? This would be very far-fetched if you just do, let's say, like a normal search on Google or Wikipedia. You really wouldn't find a notable person of that name that would have any affiliation with historic events or a cultural figure, like a fictional figure or something like that. Now there's another snippet of information that was defined by Satoshi Nakamoto. So at some stage, actually, when he already had disappeared from the online community, so it's even speculated whether it was really him depositing it, he somehow felt that on his P2P profile, so on at the foundation that I just talked about, he specified the 5th of April 1975 as his date of birth. Now, of course, he didn't have to prove it by any formal document, so it can be speculated that there was some message behind it. So one strong message is he kind of wanted to anchor himself in the Generation X, so essentially people born between 1965 and 1980. So that would give him an age in the mid-30s in the year he released Bitcoin in 2008. Now, is there any historical connection? So you can look at the exact date of a day of the year. So in 1933, the private ownership of gold became illegal in the United States. So considering that Satoshi talked about Bitcoin at least as a precious, comparable to the value finding mechanism in precious metals, and that nowadays we refer to Bitcoin often as digital gold, that connection doesn't seem to be too far-fetched. Now on the very date, so in the same year 1975, I didn't find too much. However, on the 3rd of April 1975, there was a remarkable event in the sport of chess, right? Now, why chess? Well, because a lot of very clever people do chess as a hobby and might have had maybe an interest in the game of chess even in their juvenile years. And on the 3rd of April 1975, the very famous chess champion Bobby Fischer kind of left the title match and just abandoned the game, right? So in the book you find more detail on this topic. I just leave it like this. Then in the context of computing, on the 4th of April, so just one day before his birth, that was the official foundation of the company Microsoft. It was actually still written with a hyphen at the time, by Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And on the very date, but in the year 1994, the figurehead of the Generation X kind of age group committed suicide. So that was Kurt Cobain. Then in the context of Japan, I mean, we have to consider that he tried to build up something of a Japanese identity. I didn't find a concrete date, but what is very important in Japan, a very important celebration, is Sakura, or the Cherry Blossom Festival, and the 5th of April would be a typical date. I mean, it's seasonal, it depends on the climate zone and so on, but it wouldn't be uncommon that it takes place around the 5th of April. So in the next few slides we extract some timestamps from metadata that was available from Satoshi Nakamoto. First of all, we look into translating these timestamps into Eastern time zone, and it turns out that that would more likely be towards somebody who closes work at later afternoon, while if we translate that into UTC, so more like a European time zone, we are talking about a person who is mainly sending messages and saving documents in the evening hours. So this is quite inconclusive as expected. Satoshi Nakamoto wasn't really confined to a single place, but if we have to make a likely assessment, a typical coder would have probably fit best into a European time pattern. Next, we want to look at the two versions of the Bitcoin white paper that we have available. The first one dates from the 3rd of October 2008, so a few weeks before the official release of the Bitcoin white paper, and its PDF metadata specify a location in Pacific Daylight Time, and the posting was around 2 p.m. If we translate that into Central European Daylight Time at the time, then that would correspond to more like a 11 p.m. posting. The final version, and note that we don't really have anywhere the final version from October 2008, but only from the 24th of March 2009. This is timestamped with a Mountain Daylight Time Zone, so UTC -6, at about 11 a.m. in the morning. If we translate that to Central European Time, for that particular date, we are arriving at about 6 p.m. So again, the timestamps with the time zone specification in the PDF metadata point towards actually a Western United States location, while if you were to translate this into European time zones, that looks more like a coder who would post a little bit in the later afternoons or even evenings. So what can we learn from the daily and monthly patterns of Satoshi Nakamoto's activities? If we look at the day of the week, there's no peak weekday or a bias towards weekends, which might indicate that he had no external job commitments, so no regular Monday to Friday 9 to 5 job. Looking at the months of the year, we have peaks in July and August, and some reasonable activity in February, June, and September. These are clear seasonal peaks, mainly in July and August, and that might be speculated to be attributed to an academic schedule that Satoshi Nakamoto had to follow at least in the year 2010. Many previous investigations have looked into the posting patterns of Satoshi Nakamoto, spreading across the times of a 24-hour day on the vertical axis and the course of the year on the horizontal axis. And you see that there are very distinct rest periods. Now, to analyze them, we have to make a couple of assumptions. So we assume that he starts the day with a job and mostly development, then finishes with messages and commits, kind of the results of his day's work, and that he would reasonably sleep between at least 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. And doing so, we discover a couple of irregularities. So he has probably some travel or hourly work patterns that dictate the time he had for committing to Bitcoin. These patterns actually best fit to Eastern time zone for similar reasons as explained on the recent slide. We also note in the course of the year that there's a silence on the what most Western countries take in as New Year holidays, and so he seems to be attached to a more Western kind of culture where Christian holidays around Christmas would be prevalent. And he shows a lot of activities around Thanksgiving, which would somewhat contradict that he was based in the US, or simply that he didn't have any family ties that he would observe and celebrate with. So again, this is not conclusive, but looking at this, it would be most likely that Satoshi Nakamoto was based in the United States of America or North America, Canada, or based in Europe. So there's no clear contradiction why not either of these time zones would work. So can we make any assumption about Satoshi Nakamoto's nationality and possibly country of residence? So the language expression that we already examined on an earlier slide might make it possible that he was a European with a deep immersion in both the UK and US culture, and you might argue that this might fit to people coming from the Benelux, so mainly Belgium and the Netherlands, maybe Denmark, or in Eastern Europe, Estonia. There's other clues which kind of made me present these three countries, which you also find the reasoning for in the book, but this would be a guess. His English is completely atypical for a non-native East Asian speaker. Now, this cannot be excluded, but really, like especially the expressions and the strengths of speaking and confidence he has in using the English language would be quite atypical for East Asians who especially those who wouldn't have spent formative years in the United States, Great Britain, or some Commonwealth country. Now, the locations are not really clear. I mean, in Europe, it's hard to imagine how if he didn't reside, in particular in the Benelux, or at least participated in this symposium that was mentioned in the second citation, how he could have accessed this, how he could have gotten his fingers on the times on January 3rd, 2009, and also the posting times are kind of only make sense if he was based in Europe or possibly mostly Eastern United States. There's also some indications that he was residing in the continental North American countries, Canada and United States, in 2009 and 2010. I mean, you have to imagine that he wasn't forced to stay in a certain place. He might have commuted, or he might have just chosen to travel. We don't know. And there's some indication in the server timestamps of Satoshi Nakamoto's postings on various news groups. He once used the term reference, which if you kind of put that into context of certain time zones, that would mean that he would have resided in America rather than in Europe in that context. You can also assume, even though that's not guaranteed, that most people, if they're not forced to, would have their main activity hours around daylight. So, okay, a coder might be waking up late and maybe finish up work towards midnight or slightly past. But if you assume that he wasn't having his main activity, let's say between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning or so, it's quite unlikely that Satoshi Nakamoto was having his main residence. I mean, he could have traveled there once in a while, but that he was having a main residence that was not in continental America or Europe. So kind of like especially East Coast, Canada, United States, or UK, Europe, especially Central Europe. There was one indication that a message came from a Californian IP address, which is quite confusing and not perfectly fitting into this pattern because it would be too far west. And a Japanese association is not really resulting from any metadata, right? But there is, as mentioned, a vivid cryptography scene in academia and corporations. A possible connection to the Cherry Blossom Festival, which is called Sakura, could be observed in various findings that I couldn't really expand on in this video. There's some speculation that before Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto might have had a stint in Tokyo because of certain coincidences that could be interpreted, but not confirmed that happened, maybe in the year 2006. And there's some very loose connection to the manga culture. In the course of my investigation, I also looked at the computer skills that Satoshi Nakamoto likely had, or at least was comfortable discussing about. And this was quite amazing. So just in the written documents, he had some good parlance and easily juggled with a lot of terminology that you see here on the right. So that documented that he was quite an expert on hardware, on software, on internet, on programming, especially C++, network technology, privacy enhancing technologies, web development, cross-platform development, and his main emphasis was on Windows, also Linux, but he wasn't so comfortable juggling with Mac operating system. But on the other hand, he mentioned that he had rather mediocre gear. So for a computer expert, this would mean that he was probably not very wealthy before the year 2008. That one very determining character trait of Satoshi Nakamoto was his strict privacy. So he was extremely pedantic on preserving his anonymity. So we have seen that through a clever way how to register his internet domain without leaving a formally validated name with a privacy-focused email addresses. And he never disclosed any true personal detail, right? So he never really said, oh yeah, I had a tough day with my wife or my family or my kids are going to college or he never really, he was very adamant on suppressing the release of any information on his personal life. It kind of never seemed to have slipped through his privacy shield what happens in his private life. So neither any formal stuff like where he resides, how old he is, and so on, essentially in all the discussions, he was very good at not letting any information about his private life slip through. He created a protective citadel, right? So as mentioned, there's no what I call analog communication, no personal meeting. He didn't attend, at least not under the name Satoshi Nakamoto, any meetings, no video, audio recordings. We don't have any handwritings and we don't have any physical objects, where you would have fingerprints or like scales from the skin or something. Nothing. We only have online kind of sterile material about him. He used privacy enhancing technologies. So for example, he used, which was both quite common actually, PGP, so pretty good privacy, and the Tor kind of shielding of his internet address. The reasoning, okay, as a cryptographer, that is not unseen. I mean, there are a couple of cryptographers who would apply similar things, but in combination with the anonymity and the pedantic enforcement of this privacy protection, there might also be a little element of paranoia or even a mental condition, which is also not so uncommon for ingenious people. You could also argue that actually he didn't do that only to protect himself, but it was vital to create Bitcoin's origin myth, which is, to my understanding, a vital element of the whole success story of Bitcoin. Without that origin myth, I would contend that it would have been harder for Bitcoin to get on this success path that it has unquestionably proceeded on over the last 10-15 years. It's also very clever because it evades the legal threat. So if any regulators that have, for example, knocked on the doors of companies that have tried centralized projects before where they could get their fingers on a legal entity or person, right? And then told them to shut it down, otherwise they have to go to jail or pay a huge fine. He very deliberately escaped this. So I think the origin myth, whether he wanted to create a myth, but at least it was part of evasion. So for the moment, let's deviate a little bit from our hard facts-based approach that I tried to pursue in the previous slides. So would there be any magic in the numbers, or is there any strength or vires and numeris in the number 21? And in other contexts, we also see that that might apply to the number 42. So first of all, Bitcoin shows some properties of a binary system. So we are talking about halving. So halving is a right shift operator in the binary system. And the number 21 is essentially a 10101 alternating sequence of digits, which might refer to the blockchain in a sense. Let's say the ones are the blocks and the zeros are the connecting links, which are the hashes. There might also be some geometrical symbolism in the fabric of Bitcoin. So if you look at the number 21, it's actually the sum of all the faces of a die. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 7. And if you look at opposite sides, the sum of the points on opposite sides is always 7, and you have 3 pairs of opposite sides. So that also multiplies 3 times 7 to 21. So there's a reference to a cube. So the number 21 also occurs in the magic cube. That refers to dice, which might indicate some casino games like craps or, for example, blackjack in other contexts. And the casino notion might allude actually to the banking crisis that was paralleling the release of Bitcoin in 2008-2009. Also, the ninth Fibonacci number is 21, so there's a Fibonacci cube, and it also relates to the golden ratio. Interestingly, the film 21 was released in March 2008, so about half a year before the release of the Bitcoin white paper, so at a time when it's likely that Satoshi Nakamoto did some heavy work on Bitcoin. And it was about the MIT blackjack team. So blackjack again alludes to the same thing, casinos and maybe the casino mentality of the banking system. Furthermore, Satoshi Nakamoto mentioned that he initially considered the initial Coinbase transaction to be worth 100 Bitcoin, which is kind of also like a more natural number, right? If you want to set some number, you probably go in the decimal system if you're not sticking to the binary system. So that would have meant that the total supply would result into 42 million Bitcoin, so twice as much as it actually turned out to be. And the 42 is quite known from the so-called hitchhiker, or the sequel, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the number 42 very famously represents the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. The evolution of Bitcoin has often been quoted as tightly correlated to the financial crisis of 2007-2008. Well, let's look into the facts. Supporting this hypothesis would be that Satoshi Nakamoto engraved a headline from the Times into the Genesis block of the Bitcoin blockchain, referencing to the bailout of the UK banking systems by the Chancellor. He also uttered a general anti-banking, anti-government attitude, even though not as strongly as some people say. And he was also distrustful of central banks for debasing the currencies. But against this hypothesis would be that he was stating that to have developed Bitcoin in the beginning of 2007. So only a gifted seer would have anticipated the cataclysm of the global banking crisis occurring at the end of 2008. That couldn't have been the initiator, and the concurrence of these events must have been quite fortunate for him to draw attention to the Bitcoin project. He only mentioned the crisis in the Genesis block. He never really referenced to it. And he also didn't reference to prior events like the bankruptcy of the Lehman Brothers, which was kind of the iconic event of the whole financial crisis, and also the bankruptcy of Northern Rock that occurred earlier. And also after having issued the white paper and started the Bitcoin blockchain, he didn't refer to the tanking of the Dow Jones Industrial Index, and also never referenced to the quick recovery of the stock market along the year 2009. So again, this is inconclusive, but we can say that it's not as clear as always portrayed that Bitcoin was immediately related to the banking crisis. So was Satoshi Nakamoto a die-hard cypherpunk? First of all, cypherpunk comes from the convolution of cipher, so essentially cryptography, and cyberpunk. These cyberpunks were crypto-anarchists, and the cypherpunk were those of them who could also code. The movement was initiated around the year 1990, and they issued a paper or a manifesto in the year 1993. So regarding Satoshi Nakamoto's affiliation with this movement, certainly a pro would be that he exclusively published the Bitcoin white paper on the Cypherpunk frequented mailing list, so the cryptography mailing list. But against this is that the word cypherpunk and its spirit was not passionately propagated by Satoshi Nakamoto. Actually, the term cypherpunk only occurred once in his messages, and he didn't post any ideological messages after the year 2008. And all the messages 2009 and 2010 were quasi exclusively directed towards the technological implementation of Bitcoin. So looking at these facts, it seems that a cypherpunk affiliation of Satoshi Nakamoto was certainly there, but somewhat overhyped in the communication and the narratives of Satoshi Nakamoto. Actually, way more than the cypherpunk notion of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto stressed from the very beginning the peer-to-peer spirit of Bitcoin. Right? It's stressed at several times, even in the very abstract of the Bitcoin white paper, as we've seen before. He referenced file sharing systems also based on a peer-to-peer concept like Napster and Nutella, and even used very actively Tor as a privacy-enhancing peer-to-peer concept. He actually posted, astonishingly, the Bitcoin code releases at the P2P Foundation, but he didn't even notice that this particular website didn't have any emphasis at all on computing or even less on cryptography. Bitcoin was actually the only code release that was ever posted on this forum. So ironically, even though he was very keen on pushing the peer-to-peer concept, the choice of the P2P Foundation as a release base for his Bitcoin code was definitely a gross misconception. We are sometimes tempted to confine Satoshi Nakamoto's lifespan to between the release of the Bitcoin white paper in later 2008 and his departure in 2010-2011 from the project. However, realistically, he was a real human being and had a life before and after Bitcoin. So it all didn't come really out of nothing. He must have built up significant competences based on a keen interest in crypto-related fields. He was ideologically coined, so he must have had extended exposure to the cypherpunk scene. Otherwise, he would never had exclusively released his Bitcoin white paper on this mailing list. He also showed amazing resolve in delivering Bitcoin, which is probably based on confidence he accumulated through accomplishments in previous projects, probably in similar fields. He left the project with a sentence containing that he moved on to other things. But would Satoshi Nakamoto have entirely left the tech space? This is unlikely because he showed so much passion and competence that it's hard to think that he completely stepped away from this. He probably also didn't bury all his ideals and ambitions. That just doesn't stop immediately just because he didn't continue to develop Bitcoin. And it's also unlikely that he settled to a job which didn't let him unfold his huge amount of creativity and curiosity. So let's get into some interim results. Satoshi Nakamoto displayed an English level that very close to a native speaker. I mean, he might have had an accent, but certainly in his writings you couldn't distinguish him other than his unique blend of British and US spelling and parlance. He probably had a limited track record of publications in the year 2008, and was quite atypical was his use of open office software for document presentation, while the majority of researchers in the field would have used LaTeX or at least Microsoft Word, and even the latter one was very rare. In terms of computing, he had a preference on Windows, which he also wrote the original Bitcoin code on. And he was also quite knowledgeable on Linux, but stayed a little bit away from Mac operating systems. He was an expert C++ coder and had very good competence in hard and software issues. He knew how to program internet and was also very familiar and actually using privacy enhancing technologies like Pretty Good Privacy and Tor. But he apparently only had hardware that was quite mediocre to play with when he issued Bitcoin and even did the mining. His cryptography expertise was, let's say, medium level. So some people say an advanced hobbyist or a fourth-year student or postgrad could have done this. He only used well-established methods that were pretty much available by the end of the 1990s, so 10 years before he issued essentially blockchain technology for Bitcoin. And his main invention was the Nakamoto consensus to record all transactions on a permissionless public ledger file that was maintained on a peer-to-peer network and then running this longest chain wins mining principle. Regarding electronic cash systems, at least in the Bitcoin white paper, he only referenced cypherpunk concepts, and he prioritized the peer-to-peer spirit over the performance of the network. Now, regarding the locations, we're a little bit inconclusive. So we wanted to deduce the locations from the time zones. So it seems that timestamps might have been best compatible with his location in Anglo-America, so Eastern time zones. But we have timestamps in Mountain Time Zone in October 2008 and Pacific Time Zone in 2009. And the daylight pattern can be attributed to more like East Coast. And if you consider that an coder would mostly complete his work maybe in early evening or even towards midnight, it would even point to a European location. So this is all quite inclusive, and if you look even deeper, there are even some contradictions in these time zones, so he might have fiddled around with them. He had certainly affinity to the cypherpunk movement by exclusively releasing the Bitcoin white paper on the cryptography mailing list. He was also very fond of the open source concept, and he mentioned that even that the registration of bitcoin.org was emphasizing this concept, and maybe also, as mentioned before, the publication through openoffice.org. He was very fond of the P2P concept by releasing, for example, the code base also on the website of the peer-to-peer forum, but that was evidently a misconception, so he didn't really read a lot about this before proceeding to involve the peer-to-peer foundation in his code releases. He had certain penchants. Now there's not strong evidence, but multiple evidence that also has been worked out in the book, that he liked to play around with numbers and geometries. He liked to link possibly certain context to historical events. He might have had an affection for the games of chess and certainly some gambling, and maybe some affinity to the culture of Japan. His spirit was certainly at least slightly anti-banking, anti-government, but not maybe extremely. He displayed a libertarian streak, and he might have been a cypherpunk, but not maybe like a hardcore member of this scene. And there is some correlation with the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, certainly documented by the engraving of the headline of the Times into the Genesis block of the Bitcoin blockchain, but maybe not as strong as people often quote it to be. So to wrap up this video, we covered certain sections of a book that I recently published and which is available at the link below. In particular, this video covered the sections on Bitcoin dates, on the person and personality of Satoshi Nakamoto, and possible clues to find in the digits and numeral systems that were used. And we sorted out here also this circumstantial evidence and brought that into context. If you like this video, please click the like button below and also subscribe to my channel if you're interested in the follow-ups to come.